Have you ever heard that the environment can't be racist? Environmental racism is the phenomenon of disproportionate exposure to environmental hazards and risks on basis of race or ethnicity. It has been recognized as a significant issue in the United States and other parts of the world. The history of environmental racism in the United States can be traced back to the early 20th century when policies and practices that were put in place that led to the creation of environmental inequities in communities of color. Now, one example of this is the ways in which zoning laws were used to segregate neighborhoods by race. And in the 1920s and 1930s, zoning laws were put in place in many cities that restricted where certain types of businesses and industries could actually be located. And these laws were very harmful and can be still seen today, that were to exclude businesses that were seen as undesirable from white neighborhoods, but allow them to be located in communities of color. And this brutal practice continued to be in post-World War II era, when federal governments began investing heavily in highway projects and other infrastructure projects that destroyed black and brown businesses. These projects often required the acquisition of land, and they frequently targeted communities of color for displacement. This especially was true for the construction of highways, which often cut through these communities and disrupted their social fabric and their community wealth. As a result, many communities of color were left with high levels of pollution and little access to green spaces. And this can be seen today in Los Angeles, many popular cities like Detroit, and other areas. One of my most important terms that I love to teach people about is redlining in terms of environmental racism. And redlining is the disproportionate amounts of black and brown communities living nearby communities of toxic industries, and this was due to brutal policies and practices that pushed them over here and segregated these neighborhoods. During World War II, when veterans were actually coming back to their homes, they were promised a grant or a loan that they'd be able to buy their first home. Now, many black, indigenous, or brown POC veterans were coming back, and they were working with local banks in their cities to hopefully buy a home. Now, this angered a lot of white communities because during that time, white people did not want to see a black or brown person of color in their neighborhood. They wanted to be only quote-unquote whites only. And this was very harmful. So what the white communities did is that they organized and they threatened local governments and local banks, saying, if you give them a loan, we will leave or we will sue. And of course, banks and city governments and those activists, quote unquote, worked together to make sure that black and brown veterans were not given loans to certain areas, but were only given a loan to certain areas that were already in impoverished areas that actually had high rates of environmental contamination. And there's really great examples of this, especially in Los Angeles. They're a huge victim of redlining. In Louisiana, you see it. In Miami, you see it now. And it's become such a huge issue because now we're seeing the reverse effect happening, where a lot of areas, for example, like Little Haiti in Florida, is a climate resilient city because it's able to withstand floods, is now becoming climate gentrified. And climate gentrification is so important in these conversations with environmental racism because a lot of communities that were forced to live in certain areas that were usually low income and affordable are now being expensive due to the climate crisis and their desire for them to be climate resilient towns than other areas. And that's honestly a huge disaster because we're seeing the impacts today. As a result from the development of highways, many communities of color were left with high levels of pollution and little access to those green spaces. Now, during the civil rights era of the 1950s and the 1960s, it brought renewed attention to the issue of environmental racism. And in 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed, which banned discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And this law provided a legal framework for challenging environmental racism, but it was not until the 1970s that the issue began to have significant attention from environmental activists and policymakers. One of the key events that brought environmental racism to national attention was the case of Warren County in North Carolina during 1982. Now, the state had planned to build a landfill in the country which had a population that was 60% African Americans. Residents protested the plan, arguing that it would actually target their lives and destroy a lot of their health. And these protests received national attention, the case becoming a rallying point for the environmental justice movement. And the environmental justice movement is so sacred to me because it's part of the work I do today. You cannot talk about environmental racism without environmental justice. And the 1980s and 1990s saw the emergence of the environmental justice movement, which was focused on addressing the disproportionate impact of environmental hazards on communities of color. The movement was led all grassroots organizations, many of which were located in both urban and rural areas with high levels of pollution. And one of those key figures was the father of the environmental justice movement, which is Dr. Robert Bullard. In the 1980s, Bullard conducted a study that found that race was the most significant factor in predicting the location of hazardous waste sites in Houston, Texas. And this study was so remarkable that it helped galvanize the environmental justice movement and brought national attentions to the issue of environmental racism. And today, like, the fact is me saying your zip code is the highest indicator of your health outcome is so wild to say that, because genetics only account for 30% of your health, but your zip code is 60% of your health. Another figure that we don't often talk about is the mother of the environmental justice movement, Hazel M. Johnson. And she was based in Chicago and was actually grassroots and was a mother who witnessed her own community being a dumping hazard. And she's not really always talked about in the environmental justice movements, but I know a lot of EJ elders always mention her and reference her, but her work was so remarkable in actually making the ties between your environment, race, and community action. And what she did after the death of her husband from lung cancer, I believe, and then her other children developing respiratory illnesses and herself feeling sick too, is that she went through community to community and to document and to write surveys and to actually ask community leaders like what they were experiencing. And through her own actions and own grassroots collection, she was able to demand the Chicago Public Housing Authority to be held accountable for that. And she's been recognized in a lot of environmental movements. I mean, the environmental justice leaders that we need to always remember is the indigenous communities that exist. Dr. Beverly Wright, who is still alive, Peggy Shepard from We Act for EJ for All, Catherine Flowers, who does so much work in rural communities. Like, there's so many EJ elders that are still alive today, and I think we should always remember that we have access to them. We can email them. Their published research and their work is out there, and it's super important to note that their research has really led influential moments in my life to be able to talk about certain things. In the 1990s, the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit was held in Washington, D.C., and this summit brought together activists and organizers from across the country and to talk about environmental racism, and they developed the strategies for addressing it. And this summit actually produced the 17 principles of environmental justice, which included the right to a clean environment, the right to participate in decision-making processes, and the right to be free from discrimination. And this actually helped a lot when it came to environmental policy. In response to the growing awareness of environmental racism, the federal government began to take action in the 1990s, which is horrific because I was born literally in the late 90s. I'm a 96 baby, by the way. But one of the key policy responses was the creation of the Environmental Justice Program by the Environmental Protection Agency in 1992. Now, the program was designed to address the disproportionate impact of pollution on communities of color and low-income communities. And the program provided grants for research, education, and community-based projects, and it required federal agencies to consider environmental justice issues in their decision-making processes. Now, in 1994, President Bill Clinton signed Executive Order 12898, I believe, which required federal agencies to identify and address environmental justice issues in their programs, policies, and activities. And this actually helped a lot. The order also established an interagency working group on environmental justice to coordinate federal efforts on the issue. Now, despite these policy responses, environmental racism remains still a huge issue in the United States today, where a lot of communities of color, especially low-income areas, bear the disproportionate burdens of pollution and environmental hazards. And one of the most, ones that is talked about is Flint water crisis, which began in 2014. My great friend Latricia Jackson, that is Black Millennials for Flint executive director, talked about the environmental consequences that happened in this city when the government, the local city government, decided to turn off their water and to switch to a different water that was actually just contaminated. And this led to communities of color, specifically Black communities now, that have to rely on plastic water bottles to shower, to bathe, to eat. It is so horrific to see this, and they still have not received their justice. And something I wanted to actually talk about is the East Palestine, Ohio chemical train disaster that happened a few months ago. Now, this is such an interesting issue because I think what we're seeing right now is the ways in which media was actually portraying it as a divisive issue or it's a Biden issue. I think what we need to talk about labor rights and labor organizations and labor unions because they are the ones that were advocating for equitable pay and they were being extremely overworked. And corporations do have the money to equitably pay these workers. Let's not hide it from the fact it was a corporate disaster. And the government itself, which is our US government, should have been more stricter with companies, and which is why it's so interesting to say, like, did corporations buy out the US government? And a lot of conversations are true to this day. And I think what's interesting about the East Palestine, Ohio incident is that a lot of communities were affected, but white communities that represent a large proportion of the race there are extremely angry. And there was this one conservative, I forgot their name, that said that if the US EPA government wasn't so focused on environmental racism, this wouldn't have happened. And I think that's such a divisive issue because I think what conservatives are saying that environmental racism should have been centered, this wouldn't have happened. They're ensuring that those white communities that are already enraged that their children are being poisoned and they're poisoned to redeflect that hatred towards communities of color that are already disproportionately being impacted. And so when white communities are raging and they feel institutionally betrayed by the government, I think it is important to see the parallels that we're seeing today is that white communities are not protected from environmental disasters, nor are they protected from corporate powers. Like, corporations don't care. They're like, well, that's not my community, so I don't care about that. And I think that to me was something interesting is that I don't want white communities that are currently being affected by the East Palestine, Ohio incident to redirect their anger, but actually to look for systemic change so that all of us can build together. And if anything, this is a huge opportunity for white communities to learn about environmental justice because we share the same disasters. Like, black and brown communities were dumping ground. My community in Los Angeles was nearby toxic facilities, and it wasn't shut down until the corporation actually got sold off and then they demolished it. And now a new, I think movie set studio is being built near my home, which is scary. So I do think this is a huge opportunity for a lot of communities to really build harmonious relationships for environmental justice, because the worst thing that we can do is seeing right-wing media use this as a ploy to say, yeah, it's environmental racism's fault. And I'd say that, sometimes I have these arguments with people online. They're like, Isaiah, the environment isn't racist. That's just, you're racist. And I'm like, well, you're actually true, Bob. And the environment is not racist. Nature is not racist. There are no hierarchies in nature. But you want to know who is in fact racist? It's the people in power that have pushed over brutal policies and practices that have contaminated our communities. They are the ones that are racist, and they are the ones who uphold a racist structure in society that allows for the continued practices and development of toxic projects being built in our communities. That is environmental racism, and it's not divisive. So when we talk about environmental racism, we also need to think about it's a cultural displacement. It's an act that physically and spiritually removes an individual from their community. And when you lose that community member due to long-term environmental contamination, what ends up happening actually is long-term pollutants that are killing your body. And now that we're in a medical and economic crisis, Black and brown people do not have the luxury to afford healthcare. So the options that we have is to continuously struggle. And we see this from animal agriculture in North Carolina farms. We see this from the petrochemical industries in Texas that are producing cheap plastic that are affecting Latino communities. We see this in Los Angeles and different areas where there's high level rates of air pollution and children have asthma. We also see it in noise pollution, where it's actually affecting the ways in which children are being able to beat their hearts and even to pay attention. That causes attention deficit disorders. And so I think I want people to know that environmental racism is a huge monster that is slowly poisoning our bodies. And we cannot really talk about justice and the environment and equity without addressing environmental racism. And so to me, as someone who comes from an EJ community, This is why I talk about environmental racism, is to continue the conversation that we need and for us to build that power to push legislation and policy that actually protects our communities. If you enjoyed this video on environmental racism, let me know what you want to learn in the comments below. Have you learned about environmental racism? Do you feel like you need to learn more about the history? Let me know any questions, comments, or concerns that you may have about this video. And let me know in the comments below if there's a certain EJ activist or scholar that you love to follow. And let's talk about environmental justice together. Thank you.